Hello, donc Louis Armstrong, quelle attitude? Armstrong, Louis et Merriman, Richard, 1966, Louis Armstrong, A Self-Portrait, New York, The Eakins Press. And the audience, the ordinary public, thought I was a maniac or something, running amok. I was only standing on my head, blowing my brains out to please the musicians. I forgot about the audience, and it didn't do me no good. See, I think when I commenced to put a little showmanship in with the music, people appreciated me better. Always used to play one number after another, one after another. What the hell, just another blasting blend, and pretty soon you got everybody's backs. But in New York, I began having to get out there to the mic and tell the people what we are going to play and that's happening. And I got to be around great actors like Bill Robinson. So I found out the main things is live for that audience, live for the public. If the people ain't sick of it, I ain't. It's a pleasure. The minute you sing Hello Dolly, there are always some cats out there saying Tear, like the old timer told me when I left New Orleans. Stay before them people. Please the public. Well, I'm with him. Who knows who's improvising? All trumpet players can hear what you play and they can play the same notes. That's why it was so silly when Freddie Keppard, in all his ego, there in New Orleans, used to keep a handkerchief over his so nobody could see what he was doing. And always, once you got a sudden solo that fit in the tune, and that's it, you keep it. Only vary it 2 or 3 notes every time you play it, especially if the record was a hit. There's always different people there every night, and they just want to be entertained. J'étais terrorisée encore plus que le jour où le boxeur noir Jack Johnson avait envoyé Jim Jeffries au tapis. Ce jour-là, j'étais allée chercher ma provision de journaux chez Charlie qui employait beaucoup de jeunes vendeurs noirs tels que moi. Sur Canal Street, j'étais tombée sur une bande de gamins noirs qui piquaient un sprint dans ma direction. J'avais intercepté l'un d'eux pour lui demander la raison de cette fuite éperdue. Tu ferais mieux de courir, négro, m'avait-il répondu, le souffle court, en me tirant par le bras. Jack Johnson a mis Jim Jeffries KO, les blancs l'ont mauvaise, on va tous trinquer. Firestone Ross, 1993, Swing, 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 The Life and Times of Benny Goodman. New York, Norton. Ben Pollack's concern with showmanship and presentation was something that was expected of every band leader of that time, even those jazz musicians who were most esteemed by the purists. In the early days, jazz wasn't considered an art, it was song and dance music. The trumpet player Max Kaminsky reminds us. In 1926, at the Sunset Cafe in Chicago, Louis Armstrong and these other musicians, including Earl Hines, used to close the floor show by doing the Charleston, and they really did it. These jazzmen thought of themselves as entertainers, and they used comedy routines as a regular part of their performances. Ira Hitler, 1985, Swing to Bop, New York and Oxford University Press. Trummy Young, another thing about Louis Armstrong, he didn't care if he got through to people. He got through to himself. You see, you can't fool yourself. He loved people, but he told me once, Trummy, when I go on that bandstand, I don't know nobody's out there. I don't even know you're playing with me. Play good and it will help me out. I don't know you're up there. I'm just playing. Horn Gerald, 2019, Jazz and Justice, Racism and the Political Economy of the Music, New York, Monthly Review Press. Playing before often drunken audiences, replete with racists with pistols, Armstrong and other artists were vulnerable as they focused on their performances and not necessarily the dangers that lurked. Louis Porter, Allman Michael, 1993, Jazz from its origins to the present, Englewood Cliffs, Prentice Hall. Louis Armstrong became one of America's great entertainers, known as much, it is said, for his singing as for his trumpet, loved for his jokes and endearing stage mannerisms as well as for his playing. Those mannerisms have made people, black and white, uneasy. Some have criticized Armstrong's place in the entertainment world as if jazz were ever in this country and connected to that world. Armstrong's biographer, James Lincoln Collier, in a sometimes condescending book, opines that the audiences that adored Armstrong loved him only for his singing and for his jokes, and describes him as an insecure man who became the helpless victim of a crass entertainment world. He was helpless, it is suggested, because he was always searching for the father he never had. A man of great and varied talents, and of great integrity, Armstrong, we feel certain, would have found such opinion incomprehensible. He did not separate his music making from his entertaining, or his trumpet playing from his singing. Collier criticized Armstrong for his supposedly compulsive work habits, his obsessive need for applause. When Armstrong talked about his career, he merely pointed to his horn and said, "That's my living and that's my life." It's fruitless to condescend to Armstrong's audiences as well. His audiences responded to his personality and stage presence because that personality and presence were essential to his music as well. No one came to an Armstrong concert to hear his jokes, but fans laughed at them because they were told with the same exuberant warmth with which Armstrong played and sang. We might regret the showboating solos Armstrong sometimes settled for in the 30s, and criticize his repertoire towards the end of his life. We would prefer that his biggest hit, the Potato Head Blues from 1927, rather than that Hell Dolly from 1963. But those who listen to Armstrong sing Hello Dolly, Mac the Knife, or even Blueberry Hill will hear incomparably personalized versions of popular songs no worse than many of the ones he sang in the 30s. Armstrong was always part of the entertainment world. He became an internationally recognized star without losing his countryish charm. He played for kings, but never forgot his home folk. Collier criticizes Armstrong for preferring to socialize with blacks, and not just blacks, but working class blacks. That preference seems to us inevitable. Those who wish that he had been consistently dignified in manner and repertoire are applying standards of seriousness to Armstrong that may never have been conceived had Armstrong not played so sublimely. He pleased huge crowds wherever he went, while being dismissed by some critics. Those dismissals seem hardly fair. He couldn't recapture the feeling of discovery that we hear in his music of his late 20s, but Armstrong continued to play and sing inimitable into his 60s. Garvin Bushell, 1998, Jazz from the Beginning, New York, Da Capo. It was in Chicago that Bushell encountered the clarinet-playing and drumming Johnny and Baby Dots, who were performing with Oliver. His observations about them laid to rest the idea that artistic sense of life and of one's personal importance did not arrive until the so-called Bop era of the middle 40s. He says of the Dodds brothers, they felt very highly about what they were playing, as though they knew they were doing something new that nobody else could do. I'd say that they regarded themselves as artists, in the sense we use the term today. Uh-oh. The academic and paternalistic window was opened and some bad air was let out. Préface de Stanley Crouch. Hugues Panassier, 1934, le jazz hot, Paris, Coréa. Après les belles années dont il a été question, il devait arriver à Louis Armstrong une triste aventure. Son succès était devenu si grand que des managers furent tentés de l'exploiter. Ils incitèrent le trompettiste noir à devenir un showman, c'est-à-dire un exécutant aussi agréable à voir qu'à entendre, en d'autres mots un acteur. Or, Louis possédait de grands dons d'acteur, son esprit d'invention se manifestant là comme ailleurs. Au début, tout allait bien. Louis se produisait de plus en plus sur scène, accompagné de divers orchestres, et remportait de beaux succès aussi bien au point de vue musical qu'au point de vue spectaculaire. C'est seulement en 1931 que les choses se gâtèrent lorsque Louis tomba entre les mains d'un déplorable manager, Johnny Collins. Celui-ci, voyant les dons physiques étonnants du grand trompettiste, l'encouragea à tirer son instrument les notes les plus aiguës possibles afin de stupéfier le public. Louis, qui gagnait relativement peu d'argent pour sa valeur, se laissa probablement convaincre que c'était là le moyen d'obtenir un succès plus considérable. Il s'efforça d'obtenir une facilité d'exécution de plus en plus grande dans le registre aigu de la trompette et se mit à jouer des solos sans queue ni tête, consistant à répéter le plus de fois possible le contrut ou d'autres notes aiguës. Son record fut, croyons-nous, 250 contrutes à la file terminée par un contrefa, à la suite de quoi il était mort d'épuisement. Naturellement, le côté musical était négligé dans tout cela, d'autant plus que Louis, pour devenir plus spectaculaire, se mettait à gesticuler sur scène, se livrant à des mimiques parfois burlesques. John Hammond, à présent, Louis tire toutes ses notes aiguës parce que son manager l'a persuadé que c'était le moyen de gagner de l'argent. Pauvre Louis. Il ne lui est jamais permis d'être lui-même, jusque dans les disques. Autrefois, lorsque Louis Armstrong, au cours de ses improvisations, montait dans le registre aigu, c'était par inspiration, parce que son développement mélodique l'amenait là tout naturellement. Depuis 1931 et surtout 1932, Louis tire au contraire des notes aiguës sans s'occuper de l'intérêt musical des phrases, mais uniquement pour montrer sa technique instrumentale, fournir des effets clinquants de virtuose. Hazel Carby, 1999, It just is that way sometime. The sexual politics of women's blues in Dubois and Carole Ruiz, Unequal Sisters, Multicultural Reader in U.S. Women's History, New York Routledge, Cité in Walser, Robert Keeping Time, Readings in Jazz History, New York Oxford University Press, 1999. And Shirley Williams has argued that the early blues singers and their songs helped to solidify community values and heighten community morale in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. The blues singer, she says, uses song to encourage reflection and create an atmosphere for analysis to take place. The blues was certainly a communal expression of Black experience which had developed out of the call and response patterns of work songs from the 19th century and have been described as a complex interviewing of the general and the specific and of individual and group experience. John Coltrane has described how the audience heard we even if the singer said I. Of course, the singers were entertainers, but the blues was not an entertainment of escape or fantasy and sometimes directly represented historical events. Scott DeVoe, 1997, The Birth of Bebop, A Social and Musical History, Berkeley, University of California Press. The bebop pioneers were, on the whole, too deeply invested in the orthodoxies of the time, the progressive fascination with chromatic harmony, the professional advantage associated with overt displays of virtuosity, to model their style directly on Lester Young's understated approach. It was not until considerably later, in the 1950s, that a younger generation of musicians would do so. Nevertheless, they saw in Young's example a way of extending the legacy of Coleman, Hawkins, and other harmonic improvisers in new and unexpected directions. But in 1940, all this lay in the future. Bebop was still several years away, and Coleman Hawkins' famous recording was rapidly finding its way into jukeboxes and record collections across the country. Body and Soul established Hawkins as the preeminent improviser of his generation. Its success in the marketplace held out the possibility that an African American instrumentalist, presented without the trappings of entertainment or even the surrounding context of a dance band, offering little to the general public beyond a superbly polished virtuoso idiom, could nevertheless find favor. For the next several years, Hawking labored to make the most of the opportunity. The broad-based acceptance he hoped for as a swing band leader was not to materialize, but the more specialized territory that he eventually staked out as compensation became the fertile ground out of which bebop sprang. But the transition from swing to bebop is more than the passage from one style to another. Bebop is the keystone in the grand historical arch, the crucial link between the early stage of jazz and modernity. Indeed, it is only with bebop that the essential nature of jazz is unmistakably revealed. There is an implicit entelechy in the progression from early jazz to bebop. The gradual shedding of utilitarian associations with dance music, popular song, and entertainment, as both musicians and public become aware of what jazz really is or could be. With bebop, jazz finally became an art music, and this, in a sense, is the goal toward which the straight line of development in modern historical narratives, consciously or unconsciously, has always been aimed. In Hayden White's terms, it is a romance, a triumph for black musicians and their liberal white colleagues and supporters over adverse circumstances. Bebop allowed jazz to become what its partisans had said it should have been all along. Martin Williams, an autonomous art, transcending its sometimes squalid social and economic setting, and taking its place in American culture as a creative discipline of intrinsic integrity. Once this goal is accepted, the whole narrative for jazz history must be adjusted accordingly. For if bebop is the juncture at which jazz becomes art music, then earlier styles are once again in a precarious position unless it can be demonstrated that in some important sense they had always been art music, and that this status was simply unacknowledged. Unfortunately, much that must be counted as early jazz can be understood as an autonomous art music only in retrospect, and with some difficulty. The least dogmatic of these narratives is that which allows for the fusion of jazz with currents in popular music, especially black popular music. Fusion subverts from the outset the assumptions that popular and art are mutually exclusive categories, and that the progress from the latter to the former in jazz was irreversible. In the 1930s and early 1940s, jazz had been both artistic expression and entertainment for the black community. But by the 1950s, the earlier and less prestigious functions of the music had been passed on to rhythm and blues. Bill Egan, 2004, Florence Mills, Harlem Jazz Queen, Lanham in Toronto, and Oxford Scarecrow. A few days before the opening, the announcement came that Florence was to make a concert appearance early in the new year at the Aeolian Hall. She would perform Levy Land, a modern suite for voice and chamber orchestra, 12 musicians, by William Grant Still. This was a set of songs Still had offered to write for her. Drawing from the Dixie to Broadway the theme representing the evolution of the colored race, the song would portray black people in a traditional setting. Meanwhile, general audience reaction to Blackbirds was very favorable. The Aeolian concert took place at the peak of the Harlem Renaissance. This was the era of the new Negro, who was expected to fulfill the high intellectual expectations of the cultural leaders of the Renaissance. The attitude of these leaders toward entertainers and jazz musicians was ambivalent. In Dr. Samuel Fliot's words, in the early years of the Renaissance, there was a sharp line dividing intellectuals from show people as far as creative artists were concerned. Literary writers, classical musicians, and actors in the legitimate theatre were in the former category, while the latter category comprised jazz and pop musicians and other entertainers. Jeffrey Lane, 2013, Jazz and Machine Age Imperialism, Music, Race, and Intellectuals in France, 1918-1945, Ann Arbor, University of Michigan Press. Jazz too had changed, with the arrival of bebop in France signaling the music's definitive shift from an entertainment to a serious art form. Paul Lopez, 2002, The Rise of a Jazz Art World, Cambridge, Cambridge University Press. In 1957, jazz trumpeter Dizzy Gillespie criticized the continued lack of respect in America for jazz as more than a lowbrow entertainment. Gillespie's criticism came surprisingly at a time when jazz was enjoying a resurgence in national recognition as well as a booming commercial market in recordings and live performances. It was in fact the peak of a renaissance in jazz music, a rebirth of jazz as a high art movement that, over the 2 decades of the 1950s and 1960s, transformed American music. Eric Nisenson, 2000, Open Skies, Sonny Rollins and His World of Improvisation, Cambridge, Da Capo. Besides producing their musical advances, these musicians were also trying to change the image of the jazz musician as simply an entertainer. This is not to say that previous jazzmen were not true artists, or that they did not view the music they played as genuine art. But the boppers wanted to separate themselves as far as possible from the expectations of the white audience. This too was of crucial importance to Sonny Rollins. We already felt like we were not part of the mainstream of American society. Then a music came along that was expressing this kind of view. Later on, John Coltrane and I were called the Angry Tenors. We were not angry, but we had strong views about American society. Bebop reflected our alienation from the mainstream. My friends and I believed that bebop was the first musical movement to completely turn away from the minstrel image of most black entertainment. It was a complete opposite, and it was a new birth of freedom. It was more than music, it was a social movement, and we wanted to be part of it. We didn't want to be entertainers per se, we wanted to be serious musicians. That is one of the reasons why Charlie Parker was so important. Charlie Parker didn't joke around like Ditsy did. Charlie Parker would just stand up straight and play. It was just a complete change. In order to play jazz, you have to be honest to your audience, and especially honest to yourself. Racism has no place in jazz. If you can play, you can play. That's what jazz is, really. Guys are playing with no consideration of color. Bebop was so great because guys were playing on such a high plane with each other. Everybody was trying to get into the music. The music itself was such a free expression. It's the greatest thing in the world to be able to create right on the spur of the moment, and to be able to get into yourself to that extent. You have to be honest. You really have to be a person of social awareness to do that. Maybe it is not possible to live in America and not be racist to some degree, but to be a jazz musician, you have to confront that more in your life. Because guys had to know that it was a matter of merit. The ability to play, to pursue this truly creative art form, is something that has nothing to do with racism. Hugues Panassier, 1965, La bataille du jazz, Paris, Albin Michel. Il faudrait renoncer une bonne fois pour toutes, j'imagine, à juger le jazz d'après les poncifs européens du XXe siècle et à exiger d'un concert de jazz qu'il se soumette au canon des concerts classiques. Pour les Noirs, la musique n'est pas quelque chose qu'on écoute la tête dans les mains. C'est un entertainment, pour employer un mot anglais qui n'a pas d'équivalent exact en français, disons faute de mieux, une distraction, un passe-temps agréable. Les jeunes jazzmen noirs vous le diront aussi bien que leurs aînés. Un peu contradictoire du coup. Ah, salut Farid. Voilà, ouais, Coltrane, ouais, ouais. Oui, divertissement, mais divertissement, c'est pas exactement l'entertainment, le mot anglais. Ça ne traduit pas assez précisément. Mais voilà, c'était la fin. Moi, je vais me coucher parce que demain, je me lève à 7h20 et j'ai besoin de 10 heures de sommeil. Donc je te dis bonne nuit. Merci.